I have buried men I hated and men I loved, and I have never been able to tell you which was harder. That's the kind of thing you learn out here in the flat country where the wind doesn't stop, and the sky presses down on you like the hand of something that stopped caring a long time ago. I'm telling you this at the start so you know what kind of man is doing the talking. Not a good one. Not a bad one either, I hope. Just one who kept a ledger because a ledger doesn't lie to you the way memory does. My name is Elias Rourke, and in the autumn of the year I'm about to tell you about, I found a woman standing alone in the burnt-out ruin of everything she had, with nowhere on this earth to go. And I did the thing I have regretted and blessed in equal measure ever since. I asked her to come with me. You'll want to know how it ended. Everybody always wants to know how it ended. But that's the wrong question, and by the time I'm done you'll understand why. The ending isn't the part that changed me. The middle is. The long, ugly, tender middle that nobody sings about. So let me start where it started. Not at the beginning. I don't believe in beginnings anymore. But in the middle of the worst morning of that year, with smoke still rising and my horse refusing to walk any closer. The gelding balked at the ridge, and I didn't blame him. Blackwater sat below us in the shallow bowl of the valley, or what was left of it, and the smell reached us before the sight did. You know the smell. If you've ever stood downwind of a thing that should never have burned, you know it. Wood smoke is clean, honest. This wasn't that. This was the sweetish, clinging stink of a settlement gone under, and it got into the folds of my coat and stayed there for 3 days after. I sat the horse a long minute. That's a habit of mine, sitting, looking, keeping still until the picture settles. My father used to say I was slow. He meant it as an insult. I took it as a survival trait. Men who move fast in country like this tend to move themselves right into a grave. Below me, the settlement was mostly ash. Not burned to the ground, that would have been cleaner. Half burned. A structure gives up its bones grudgingly. There were still walls standing, black and leaning, and the frame of the trading post rose up crooked against the gray sky like the ribs of something enormous that had lain down to die. Smoke drifted from a dozen places in thin gray threads, the way it does when a fire has eaten what it wants and is picking at the leftovers. I counted. That's another habit. I count things the way another man might pray. 9 standing structures or partial ones. No movement in any of them, no dogs. In a live settlement there are always dogs, and their absence told me more than the smoke did. I took out the ledger. It's a small thing, that ledger, cheap leather gone soft as a woman's glove from years in my saddlebag, and I have filled a dozen of its brothers over the years. I write down what I see. Not thoughts, God spare us my thoughts, but facts, the date, the place, what the light was doing, how many head of cattle, which men owed me and which men I owed. My wife, before she passed, used to laugh at me for it. You'll write your own dying down, she said, and get the spelling wrong. She was probably right. She usually was. I wrote Blackwater, burned 4 days, maybe 5. No living scene, wind from the north. Then I put the ledger away and did the thing I did not want to do, which was ride down into it. The gelding went reluctant, ears flat, and I let him pick his own pace. Up close the ruin was worse and also, strangely, less. Worse because now I could see the small human things the distance had hidden. A child's shoe half melted in the mud, a cookpot flung 20 feet from any hearth, a length of gingham curtain that had somehow survived, fluttering from a window frame that framed nothing now but sky. Less because there were no bodies in the open, and I had braced myself for bodies. That braced feeling is a thing I want you to understand, because it matters later. When you have lived enough years in hard country, you learn to spend your horror in advance. You imagine the worst before you arrive, so that when you get there the worst has already been paid for and you can do what needs doing with steady hands. It's a cold way to live. I don't recommend it. But it kept me upright that morning, riding down the single ruined street of a town I'd traded in 100 times, past the bones of the Hendersons' place, and the Coopers, and the smithy where old Marsh had shod my horses for 11 years. And I did not weep, because I had already spent the weeping somewhere up on the ridge. I called out once, "Anybody?" The word went out into the smoke and nothing came back. Not even an echo. Burned towns don't echo, I've noticed. The sound just goes into all that ash and stops. I dismounted at the trading post, or the frame of it, and tied the gelding to a hitching rail that was somehow still standing when the building behind it wasn't. And I stood there in the middle of it, and I felt the particular loneliness of a man who has arrived too late to do anything but witness. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the street, where the town gave way to the open grass, and I don't know how long she'd been standing there or how long she'd been watching me. That was the first thing that struck me, not fear, not pity, but the sudden cold awareness that I had been observed for some time by a person I hadn't known was there. It made the hair go up on my arms. A man alone in a burned place learns to trust his skin, and my skin was talking. She did not move. She was Apache. I knew it the way you know weather, by 100 small signs read all at once, and none of them worth breaking out separately. The way she held herself, the cut and material of what she wore, the deerskin gone dark at the hem, the single line of her against the huge gray emptiness behind her. She stood the way the country itself stood, like she had been there before the town and would be there after it, and the burning was just one more thing the land had watched happen and would not comment on. I raised a hand, slow, open palm, the oldest word there is. She didn't raise one back. But she didn't run, and she didn't reach for anything, and after a moment I understood that she couldn't run, not that she was afraid to, but that she had run out of the thing inside a person that makes running possible. I have seen that in men after a bad winter. I have felt it in myself. It's not surrender exactly. It's more like the body's admission that there is nowhere left that would be any better than here, so here we'll have to do. I walked toward her, slow, the way I do everything, and as the distance closed I saw the details the distance had spared me. She was young, but not as young as her stillness had made me think. 30, maybe, though grief and smoke age a face, and I couldn't be sure. There was a burn along the side of her left hand, angry and untended, the kind you get grabbing something you should have let burn. Her feet were bare and cut, and her eyes, when I got close enough to read them, were doing the thing I have only seen a few times in my life and hope never to see again. They were open and aware and completely, perfectly empty, like windows in a house where the fire has already passed through and gone. I stopped a respectful distance off, close enough to talk, far enough that she didn't have to feel cornered. "Ma'am," I said, because I didn't have another word ready, and ma'am was the one my mouth reached for. It sounded absurd the second it left me. Ma'am, like we were at a church social. She looked at me, just looked. And I had the disorienting sense that she was seeing me more completely and more mercilessly than anyone had seen me in years. Seeing past the coat and the gray in my beard, and the careful stillness I wore like armor, straight down to whatever was actually in there, and finding it neither better nor worse than she'd expected. Then she said in English, quiet and flat and clear, "You are too late." I have turned those 3 words over in my hands more times than I can count. You are too late, not an accusation, not even grief, quite. A fact delivered the way I deliver facts to my ledger. She was telling me the state of things, and she was right. I was too late. I'd been too late before I ever crested that ridge. I'd been too late, if I'm honest, for most of the important things in my life, always arriving with steady hands to a scene already finished. "Yes," I said, "I am." Something moved in her face when I agreed with her. I don't know what it was, not relief, but something. Maybe just the small surprise of a person braced for argument who receives instead a plain agreement. Men love to argue with grief. We love to tell the grieving that it isn't so bad, that time heals, that the departed would want us to carry on, all the useless liturgy of comfort that comforts no one but the speaker. I didn't have any of that in me that morning. I'd buried too many people to believe it. "There is no one," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," I said. I called out, nothing answered. I paused. "How long have you been standing here?" She didn't answer that. Her gaze drifted from me back down the street, toward the black frame of one particular structure near the middle of town. And it stayed there, and I understood without being told that whoever she was looking for had been in that building, and that she had already looked, and that this was why she was standing at the edge of town, facing outward instead of in. The wind shifted. It brought the smell strong for a moment and then took it away. I did the arithmetic I did not want to do. A town burns. The people who can flee, flee. The people who can't, the old, the sick, the ones who go back in for a child or a keepsake or a foolish, beloved thing, the ones who can't, don't. And a woman left standing alone at the edge of the ruin 4 or 5 days after, barefoot and burned and unmoving, is a woman who had every reason to leave, and one reason, now gone, that had held her here past all sense. I have never asked her in all the years since exactly who it was. Some doors you don't open in another person. But I knew that morning that she'd lost the specific thing that a life is built around, the load-bearing thing, and that the burning of the town was almost incidental beside it. The town was just the box the loss came in. "My name is Elias Rourke," I said. I have a place, 2 days' ride south and west, cattle mostly, some horses. I don't know why I was telling her my inventory. Maybe because inventory was the only honest thing I had. Maybe because a man who has forgotten how to be gentle reaches for the vocabulary he still owns. There's a spring that doesn't quit, and a roof that mostly doesn't leak, and I am the only living soul on it, and I have been for 3 years. She looked back at me. I'm not telling you this to frighten you, I said, though I heard how it might land. A widower rancher, alone 3 years, telling a lone woman about his empty house. I felt the shape of what that could sound like, and I hated it, and I pressed on anyway because there wasn't a cleaner way to say the thing that needed saying. I'm telling you because you're standing in a burned town with no shoes and no people, and the nearest living settlement is 4 days north through country that will not be kind to you. And I'm the only thing on this whole plain right now that's offering you anything at all. And I know what I am. I know how this looks. But I'm asking you a straight question, and you can give me a straight answer. I stopped. The wind pushed at both of us. Will you come with me? I want to be honest about something, because I said at the start I'd try to be, and a ledger's whole worth is that it doesn't flatter the man who keeps it. I did not ask her purely out of goodness. I want you to know that. I've heard this story told back to me over the years by people who weren't there, and in their telling I come out clean. The good cowboy, the rescuer, the open hand in the wilderness. That's not the man who stood in that street. The man who stood in that street had been alone for 3 years and had gotten so used to the sound of his own thoughts that they'd started to frighten him. The man who stood in that street had a wife in the ground behind his house and a silence in his kitchen that he'd stopped being able to bear. When I asked that woman to come with me, I was reaching for my own salvation as much as hers, and if I'd told you otherwise, I'd have been keeping a false ledger, and a false ledger is worse than none. So there were 2 drowning people in that street. I just happened to be the one with a horse. She was quiet a long time, long enough that the gelding stamped and blew behind me, impatient to be gone from that place, and I didn't blame him for that either. Long enough that I began, in my careful, arithmetic way, to plan what I'd do when she said no. Leave her the extra blanket, the water skin, the dried meat, ride north myself to the settlement and send someone back, knowing even as I planned it that she'd be gone or dead before anyone returned. And then she asked me a question I did not expect. Why? Not why should I trust you? Not why do you care? Just why wide open, the whole enormous why of it, why any of it, why the town burned and why she lived and why a stranger on a horse would ride down into a graveyard and offer a hand. She wasn't asking about my motives. She was asking about the shape of a universe that would arrange things this way, and she was asking it of me because I happened to be the only other person in it right then. I could have lied, I could have said something noble. Lord knows I'd have sounded better. Instead, I told her the truth, which was the only gift I had that morning that was worth anything. Because I'm alone too, I said, and I'm tired of it. And you're the first living person I've talked to in 11 days, and when I rode down here I thought I was going to find nothing, and instead I found you, and I don't have a good enough reason to leave you standing in the ashes, and I don't want to try to find one. The wind moved through the burned town. Somewhere a piece of scorched timber gave up and fell, soft into the ash. She looked at me for what felt like a long time, and then she bent, slowly, stiffly, like a much older woman, and picked up a small bundle from the ground at her feet that I hadn't even noticed was there, a wrapped thing no bigger than a loaf of bread, and she held it against her chest with the burned hand and the whole hand both, and I understood that whatever was in that bundle was the last of what she owned in the world. She didn't say yes. She walked past me toward the horse, and I have learned in the years since that sometimes that's what a yes looks like, not a word, but a body turning toward the only warmth on offer, and trusting a stranger not because it believes he is good, but because it has run entirely out of any other choice, and has decided, against all the evidence of a burned town, to gamble one more time on a human being. I followed her to the horse. I didn't say anything else. Some moments you don't decorate. I lifted her up behind the saddle. She was lighter than she should have been, and I felt the tremor in her, the deep bone-cold shaking of a body that has been running on nothing for days. And I swung up in front of her, and I felt the small, careful way she held herself apart from me, not touching more than she had to, the bundle between us, and I clicked to the gelding, and we started up out of the valley. At the top of the ridge I stopped. I don't know why. The gelding wanted to go. But I stopped, and I turned in the saddle, and I made myself look back at Blackwater one last time, at the black bones of it, the thin gray threads of smoke, the place where a town had been and wouldn't be again. Behind me, I felt her turn and look too. She made a sound, just one. Not a word, not a sob, just a single low sound pulled up out of somewhere I don't have a name for. The sound a person makes when they are looking at the last of a whole world going cold. And then she faced forward again, and I faced forward, and I nudged the gelding down the far side of the ridge, and the burned town dropped out of sight behind us, and neither of us said one word for a long, long time. The wind followed us south. It was the only thing that did. I made camp that first night in a dry wash where the wind couldn't reach us, and I built the fire small, because I'd noticed the way her whole body went rigid at the first flare of the flint, the way her eyes fixed on the flame and stayed there, and I understood that fire meant something different to her now than it had a week ago. So I built it small, and I built it fast, and I kept it low, and I put myself between her and it without making a show of doing so. She didn't eat at first. I set the dried meat down near her, not handing it to her, just setting it within reach the way you'd set feed near a horse that's been mistreated, letting her come to it in her own time. She watched me the way that horse would, too, watching my hands, watching where they went, cataloging me. I let her. A person who's been shown that the world can burn down around them has earned the right to be careful. I took out the ledger by firelight and I wrote the date, and then I sat with the pencil not moving for a while because I didn't know how to write down what had happened that day in a way that a fact could hold. In the end I wrote, found one living at Blackwater, coming south with me, does not say her name. I looked at that a while, then I closed the ledger. You don't have to tell me your name, I said to the fire more than to her. I'm not asking. A name's a thing a person gives, it's not a thing you take. She was quiet, the fire ticked. The gelding shifted in the dark beyond it. And then, so quiet I almost missed it under the wind, she said something in her own language, 3 or 4 soft syllables I didn't know and couldn't have repeated. I looked up. She was looking at the fire, not at me. That was his name, she said, in English now. The one I was looking for. I didn't ask which one. I didn't ask his. I just nodded, slow, and looked back into the fire, and let the name she'd said sit in the air between us where she'd put it, the way you'd let a man lay a stone on a grave. We didn't speak again that night. But in the morning, when I woke stiff and cold in the gray before dawn, the dried meat was gone from where I'd set it, and she was sitting up already, watching the east go pale, the bundle in her lap, and when she felt me stir, she turned and looked at me, and for just a moment, just one, there was something in her face that wasn't emptiness. I don't know what to call it. It wasn't hope. It was too early for hope, and we both knew it. But it was the look of a person who had decided, for reasons of her own, to see one more sunrise, and having decided that, to see the one after it. It would have to be enough, for that morning it was. We rode south. The second day out from Blackwater, she spoke without being spoken to for the first time, and it was to correct me. I've been talking to the gelding. That's a thing you do, alone in the country long enough. You talk to the horse because the horse won't argue and won't leave, and because the sound of a human voice, even your own, keeps a certain kind of madness at arm's length. I'd been telling him about the water ahead, a seep I knew of at the base of a rock shelf, half a day on, telling him to hold on, that we'd all drink soon. And I said something about it being the only water for 20 miles. There is more, she said behind me, north of the shelf under the dead cottonwood. I turned my head. There's a dead cottonwood north of the shelf. There is water, she said, so there is a cottonwood, or was. I sat with that a moment. I'd ridden this country for 15 years, and I knew it the way I knew my own hands, and I had not known about the water north of the shelf. She'd never been here. I'd have staked the ranch on it. And yet she knew, the way you know that where there is smoke there is fire, that the land keeps its logic and you can read forward from a thing you can see to a thing you can't. I knew the country like a man knows a page he's read 100 times. She knew it like a woman who could read the language it was written in. I didn't say any of that. I just said, we'll check it, and we did, and there was a cottonwood, long dead, silver gray and split by lightning, and at its foot a seep of water cleaner than the one I'd been aiming for. We watered the horse there. She got down on her own. She was steadier that day, though still moving like her bones hurt, and she cupped the water in her good hand and drank, and then she did a thing that stayed with me. She wet her burned hand in the seep slow, and held it there in the cool water a long time with her eyes closed, and her face didn't change at all. And I understood that the burn had been hurting her the whole time, for 2 days, and she had said nothing, because saying something was a thing you did for yourself, and she had not yet decided she was worth doing things for. I have thought about that a great deal since. About how the deepest wound a person carries is often the quiet one, not the loss they'll tell you about, but the smaller truth underneath it, the one where they've stopped believing their own pain is worth mentioning. That's the wound that kills people slow, not grief. Grief you can survive. It's the thing grief teaches you about your own worth that finishes the job. I got the little tin of salve out of my saddlebag. I'd carried it 3 years, cracked and half-dry, from back when there'd been someone to doctor, and I held it out to her across the seep, not reaching toward her, just holding it in my open palm where she could take it or not. She looked at it, looked at me, and for a second I thought she'd refuse out of that same terrible arithmetic that had kept her silent. Then she took it, and that was the second yes. Smaller than the first, but I've come to think a harder one. The first yes was to a stranger, and desperation makes those easy. The second yes was to being cared for, and there is nothing in this world harder than that for a person who has decided they don't deserve it. She told me her name on the third day. We were riding through the broken country north of the Malpais, where the land buckles up into red rock and the trail thins to a thread, and I was leading the gelding on foot through a bad stretch of scree, and she was walking behind, and out of nowhere to my back she said, "Nate." I stopped, turned. "My name," she said. "Nate, it means—" She paused, and I watched her look for the English and not quite find it. "A gate. A place you pass through, between one thing and another." "Nate," I said, careful with it, trying to give it back the way she'd given it to me. I don't know if I got the shape of it right. But she didn't correct me, and I've called her by it every day since, and if I've been saying it wrong for all these years, she's never once told me so, and there's a whole kind of love in that, in letting a man mispronounce your name for a lifetime because he's trying. "Elias," I said, which she already knew, but it seemed only fair to offer mine back plainly, a second time, now that we were trading real things. "Elias," she said. And then, with the ghost of something that on a better day might have been dry humor, "It is an easier name than mine." "Everything about me's easier than it should be," I said. "It's my great failing." She almost smiled. I saw it start, and I saw her decide against it, the way you'd stop yourself laughing at a funeral. But it had been there. I wrote it in the ledger that night, not the almost smile, I'm not that kind of fool, but I wrote Nate and I underlined it once, which for me is the same as a man carving initials in a tree. I should tell you about the bundle now, because this is where I learned what was in it, and because it's the heaviest thing I carry from those days, and I've never set it down. The fourth night, a storm came up out of the southwest, the kind that gives you an hour's warning if you're paying attention, and then falls on you like the roof of the sky coming in. I found us an overhang, a shallow cave that was really just a place where the rock leaned out far enough to keep the worst of it off, and I got the gelding in against the back wall and got a fire going in the mouth of it, and we sat there while the storm walked over us, thunder cracking so close it came up through the stone into my spine. She had the bundle in her lap, the way she always did. And when the lightning was at its worst, one strike so near that the whole cave lit blue-white and the gelding screamed and reared, she folded herself over that bundle the way a mother folds over a child and held it, and I saw her lips moving, and I understood. I didn't say anything that night, but in the morning, gray and washed clean, the storm gone off north to trouble somebody else, she unwrapped it. I want to be careful how I tell this, because it isn't mine to tell, not really, and there are parts I'll keep. But I'll tell you this much, because it's the part that changed me. It wasn't a child. I'd thought, God help me, I'd let myself half think that it might be, and I'd been carrying that dread for 4 days. It wasn't. It was smaller things. A pair of small moccasins, beadwork across the toe in a pattern I didn't know and couldn't ask about. A knife with a worn bone handle. A twist of dark hair bound with sinew. And a flat river stone, gray, ordinary, worn smooth, with nothing to mark it as anything. The kind of stone you or I would step over without a glance, that meant nothing to anyone alive but her and everything. She laid them out on the unwrapped cloth in the morning light, and she looked at them, and then she looked at me and she said, "These are all of them. This is my whole family. This is everyone I have." And I understood that she was showing me on purpose, that this was a thing she was giving me, the way she'd given me her name. She was telling me who she was mourning in the only language that could hold it, which was not words but objects, each one a person, each one a door into a room that had burned. The moccasins were a child. The knife was a man. The hair was, I don't know, I didn't ask. The stone was somebody, some particular somebody, and the fact that it was just a stone, that I couldn't tell it from 10,000 other stones, that was the whole unbearable point. That a person can be so precious to one heart and so invisible to the world that, when they're gone, the only monument is a rock that only one living soul on earth can tell apart from all the others. Thank you, I said. It was inadequate. Everything is inadequate at a moment like that. But I've found that people forgive you the inadequacy if they can see you mean it. Thank you for showing me. She wrapped them back up, slow, each one in its order, and I never saw them again. But I knew they were there between us on the horse every mile after that, and I rode a little more careful for knowing it. Here's the heavy part, the morally heavy thing that the storytellers who make me out to be clean always leave out, because it doesn't fit the shape of the good cowboy. On the 5th day we came on men. 3 of them riding up from the south, and I knew 2 of them by sight and knew them for what they were, which was the kind of men who go where the trouble's been and take what the fire left. Scavengers, buzzards on horseback. There'd always been a rumor in that country that Blackwater hadn't burned by accident, that it had been helped along, and looking at those 3 men riding fat and easy through a country full of the dead, I did not have to work very hard to believe it. They hailed us friendly. That's the thing about men like that. They're always friendly, right up until they aren't. The big one, Calder, I'd played cards with once and disliked ever after. He looked at me, and he looked at Nate behind me on the horse, and something moved behind his face that I did not like at all. "Rurk," he said, "long way from your grass." "Buying horses north," I said, which was a lie and an old one, and I let it sit. His eyes kept going to Nate. "That's an Apache woman," he said, like I might not have noticed. "That's a woman," I said. "Blackwater woman?" He smiled when he said it, and I understood in that smile several things at once. I understood that these men knew Blackwater had burned, and knew it in more detail than a man ought to know a thing he'd only heard about. I understood that there was money, or the belief in money, attached to survivors of it, bounty or grudge or the settling of some account I'd never know the shape of. And I understood that Calder had already, in the space of that smile, decided that Nate was a thing to be taken, and was now only working out whether I was an obstacle worth the trouble. Here is the heavy part. I had a choice. I've turned it over 10,000 times. I could talk. I'm a talker. It's the one weapon I've always trusted. And I could try to lie us out of it, spin some tale about her being my hand's wife or a mission Indian or anything, and maybe it works and maybe we ride on. Or I could do the other thing. The other thing was this. Those 3 men were fed and mounted and armed, and I was one man with a woman half dead of grief behind me, and the only advantage I had in the whole world was that they didn't yet know I'd decided. Men like Calder move on a schedule. They talk first. They enjoy the talking. And in the space where he was still enjoying it, still savoring the smile, still certain he had all the time there was, in that space a man who'd already decided could do a great deal. I want to tell you I found a clever way. That my gift for talking saved us and nobody had to bleed. It didn't and somebody did, and I'm not going to lay it out for you in detail because I'm not proud of it, and because Nate was behind me and I've never once asked her how much she saw. I'll tell you only that I moved first, and I moved while Calder was still smiling, and that when it was over there were 2 horses running loose across the flat and 1 man riding hard south who I let go because a man running is a man not fighting, and that I was shaking so bad afterward I couldn't have hit the ground with my hat. And I'll tell you the thing that's the actual weight of it, the thing I wrote in the ledger that night with a hand that wouldn't hold steady. I was glad. Not glad it happened, glad I'd been the one still standing. Glad in a low, animal, shameful way that I have never confessed to another living soul until right now, that when it came to it, when it was them or her, I hadn't hesitated, hadn't reached for talk, hadn't been slow. All my life my father called me slow and I took it for a virtue. And in the one moment it mattered most I found out I could be fast as a snake when the thing behind me was worth being fast for. And I did not know until that day that I had that in me. And I have never been entirely comfortable in my own skin since, knowing it's there. Nate didn't say anything for a long time after. We rode. The sun went down. And when we camped she came and sat closer to the fire than she ever had, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her arm near mine. And she didn't say anything about the men, and neither did I. But after a while, in the dark, she said, "You did not have to." "I did," I said. No, she was quiet. You could have given me to them, it would have been easier. They would have paid, maybe, or only let you go. She turned her head and looked at me, and the firelight was in her eyes, and they were not empty anymore. They were full of something terrible and clear. You could have, many would have, why did you not? And there it was again, her question, the same one from the burned street. Why? And I had a truer answer this time, and it cost me more to say it. Because I've spent my whole life being too late, I said. Too late for my father to think well of me, too late to say the things I should have said to my wife before the fever took her. Too late for Blackwater. My whole life I show up after with steady hands, and I bury what's already dead. I looked at the fire. And you're the first thing in 3 years I got to be on time for, and I wasn't going to waste it being reasonable. She didn't answer, but she didn't move away from the fire, or from me. And when I woke in the night, cold, the fire down to coals, there was a blanket over me that I hadn't put there, and she was asleep sitting up with the bundle in her lap and her back against the rock, keeping a kind of watch even in sleep. And I lay there under the blanket she'd given me, and I did not move, because I didn't want her to wake and take back the fact of having done it. We were 1 day from the ranch. I could feel it the way you feel home in your body before you see it, the country starting to soften into grass I knew, the shape of a particular mesa on the horizon that meant we were close. And I felt something I hadn't expected, riding toward my own home for the first time in 11 days. I felt afraid. Because the ranch was where the story had to become real. Out on the trail we were 2 people surviving, and survival is simple. Survival doesn't ask questions. But a ranch is a life. A ranch has a kitchen with a dead woman's things still in it, and a bed I hadn't been able to sleep in for 3 years, and a silence I'd told Nate I was tired of, but had also, God help me, gotten used to, the way you get used to a bad tooth. Bringing her there meant deciding what she was to me and what I was to her, and we hadn't decided, and I was terrified of getting it wrong, of reaching for too much and frightening off the one living thing that had come into my life since the grave took my Sarah. I said none of this, but she was reading me by then the way she read the country, forward from the visible to the hidden, and that last evening on the trail, camped within sight of my own mesa, she said quietly, "You are afraid to take me there?" "Yes," I admitted. "Why?" I almost laughed, her one word again, but I answered it. "Because out here I know what I'm doing, there I don't. There's a house full of another woman's life, and I don't know how to—" I stopped. "I don't know what I'm bringing you to, or what you'd be walking into, and I don't want to make you a promise the house won't keep." She was quiet a while. Then she said something I've kept close ever since. "I am named for a gate," she said. "A place between one thing and another. All my life I did not understand why. My grandmother named me and would not say." She looked out toward the dark shape of my mesa, black against the last of the light. I think now she saw this, that I would stand in a burned place between the world that was gone and a world I could not see, and that someone would come and I would have to choose to walk through. She was silent a moment. "A gate does not choose what is on the other side. A gate only opens or does not open. I have decided to open, Elias. What is on the other side is not mine to fear. It is only mine to walk toward." I didn't have anything to say to that. Some things you don't answer, you just let them stand. We rode in the next morning. And that's where I'll stop, for now, at the edge of my own land, with the house not yet in sight over the last rise, and a woman named for a gate riding beside me toward a life neither of us could see the shape of. Because what happened when we came over that rise, and what the house had waiting, and what we became to each other and what it cost. The house was smaller than I'd remembered it. That's a strange thing, coming home. You carry a place in your head for 11 days and it grows in there, the way things do in the dark. And then you come over the last rise and there it is, low and gray and squat against the grass, one chimney and a sod roof gone to weeds, and you think, that's it. That's the thing I was afraid to bring her to. A man's whole life, and from the saddle it looks like something a strong wind would take. Nate looked at it a long time from the rise. I couldn't read her face. I'd gotten good by then at reading her, the small tightenings, the way her eyes went to water first and shade second, all the vocabulary of a careful person. But on the rise looking down at my home she gave me nothing, and I felt the fear come up in me sharp that she'd look at that poor gray house and see how little I really had to offer, and decide the trail had been a mistake. Then she said, "There is no smoke." "No," I said, "nobody's been keeping it." "A house with no smoke is not a house," she said. "It is only a box that remembers being one." She was quiet. "We will make smoke." "We..." She said we, standing on the rise before we'd even ridden down. And I want to tell you I was too worn out to notice, but I noticed. I noticed it the way you notice the first warm day after a killing winter, the one that doesn't melt anything yet but tells you the melting's coming. I didn't say anything. You don't grab at a thing that fragile. But I turned it over in my chest all the way down the slope, that one small word, and it kept me warm past all reason. The kitchen was the hard part, and we both knew it would be, and neither of us said so. Sarah's things were still where she'd left them. 3 years and I'd changed nothing. Not out of devotion, I want to be honest, but out of a kind of cowardice, because to move her cup from the shelf was to admit she wasn't coming back to drink from it, and I'd rather have lived in a museum than admit that. Her apron on its peg, her cup, the good knife she'd brought from her mother's house that I'd never once used because using it felt like theft. A house that remembered being one. Nate had the right of it. I stood in that kitchen doorway the first evening and I couldn't make myself go in, and Nate saw it, and she did a thing I'll thank her for until I die. She didn't clear it away. A lesser kindness would have swept Sarah out to make room, thinking that was mercy. Nate went in slow, and she stood at the shelf and she picked up Sarah's cup, and she held it in both hands the way she'd held her own bundle with that same terrible care, and she said, not to me, to the cup, "You were loved here, I see it. Everything here is kept the way you left it, and that is love, and I will not disturb it." Then she set the cup down again, exactly where it had been, and turned to me. "Show me which things were hers, I will learn them. I will not use them. There is room in a house for the living and the loved dead both. My people know this. We do not empty a house to fill it. We make room." And so that's what we did. She learned Sarah's things the way she'd learned the country. Sarah's cup, Sarah's knife, Sarah's chair by the window that I hadn't sat in 3 years, and she left them be. And around them, in the spaces between, she began slowly to build a life. Her own cup set on the other side of the shelf. Her own place at the table, the side Sarah had never sat on. And the strange thing, the thing I never expected, was that having her honor Sarah's things freed me from them. For 3 years, those objects had been chains. And it took a woman who'd lost her entire world, who understood better than anyone alive that you don't survive loss by erasing it, to show me that I could keep Sarah's cup on the shelf and light the stove. That remembering and living were not enemies, that a house had room. We made smoke that night, first smoke from that chimney in 3 years. I stood out in the yard in the cold and watched it go up gray against the stars, and I heard her inside moving around my dead wife's kitchen, careful and quiet, learning where things were. And I put my face in my hands and I stood there a while, and I won't tell you what I did because a ledger doesn't record everything. But I'll tell you I felt something break loose in my chest that had been frozen solid for 3 years. And it hurt like thawing hurts, which is to say it hurt worse than the freezing ever had. Winter came hard that year. I've told you the tender parts, and I'll not pretend the whole of it was tender, because it wasn't, and a false ledger's worse than none. We fought. Not often, but real, the way people fight when they're both carrying more grief than the house can hold, and it slops over the sides. She'd go silent for days sometimes, down into a place I couldn't follow, and I learned not to chase her there. Learn to just keep the fire going and the food ready and be present without pressing, the way I'd once set the dried meat within reach and waited. And I had my own bad stretches, nights I couldn't sleep in the bed and took the floor by the stove instead. And she never asked why and I never explained, and we gave each other the mercy of unexplained absences, which is a mercy married people forget to give. Because we were, by then, something like married. Not by any paper or preacher. There was no preacher for 100 miles, and neither of us wanted one. But married in the way that matters, which is that we'd chosen each other on purpose with our eyes open, knowing exactly how much the other one had already lost and might still lose. There's no romance in that kind of marriage. It's better than romance. Romance is for people who haven't been to the funerals yet. The spite carried her through the worst of that winter, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know. There was a blizzard in the deep of it, 3 days, and we lost stock, and the roof gave over the lean-to, and on the second night I was ready to talk about giving up, about riding out come spring to the settlement and starting smaller somewhere easier. And Nate looked at me across the one candle we were letting ourselves burn, and she said, flat and hard, "No, Nate." No, her jaw set in a way I'd come to know. The fire took my whole world and left me standing. It does not get to take this one too. I did not walk through the gate to walk back out of it. She looked at the candle. We keep the ranch. If it kills us, we keep it. I would rather die keeping something than live giving it away. And we kept it. God knows how, but we kept it. Out of pure stubbornness, hers mostly, that hard, bright refusal that had kept her standing in the ashes of Blackwater when standing made no sense at all. I've thought since that the same thing that had looked like emptiness in that burned street, that stillness, that refusal to run, was never emptiness at all. It was bedrock. It was the deepest kind of endurance, the kind that looks like nothing until the moment it has to look like everything. I'd found her and thought I was rescuing a broken thing. I'd rescued the strongest person I ever knew. She just happened to be resting. I could tell you about the years. There were a good many, more than I had any right to. I could tell you about the spring the grass came back and the calves dropped healthy and we stood at the fence together and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything that needed saying. I could tell you about the way she taught me to read the country the way she read it, forward from the seen to the unseen, so that in time I could find water she'd never shown me and I'd feel her approval like sun on my back. I could tell you about laughter which came back to that house slow, like a shy animal, and then stayed. I could tell you a lot of things. But I said at the start that the ending wasn't the part that mattered, and I meant it, and I'll not betray that now by dressing the years up prettier than they were. I'll tell you instead about one morning, near the end of it, because it holds the whole of what I've been trying to say. She was old by then, and so was I, and we sat out front in the 2 chairs I'd made, watching the sun come up over the mesa the way we'd watched it 1,000 mornings. And she had her bundle in her lap. She still had it, all those years. The moccasins, the knife, the twist of hair, the plain gray stone. She'd take it out sometimes, still, and lay the things in the light, and I'd learned long ago to leave her to it, that this wasn't grief exactly anymore but something closer to prayer, a keeping company with the love dead that her people understood and mine were too frightened to. And that morning she laid out the things, and she looked at them a long time, and then she looked at me and she said, "When I am gone you will keep these, with her cup, on the shelf. You will not know their names, and it does not matter. You will only know they were loved, and that is enough for a thing to earn its place in a house." "Nate, I am not being sad," she said, and there was that old dry ghost of humor. "I am doing arithmetic, like you, like your book." She almost smiled. "I am putting my affairs in order. You taught me that a person should not leave the accounting to those who come after." And I couldn't answer because she was right, and because I'd spent my whole life being on time for the deaths and late for the lives. And here at the end I'd finally, by grace I didn't deserve, got to be present for a whole life, start to end. And I did not have a single word big enough for the size of that gift. So I did the only thing I had. I reached over across the space between the 2 chairs and I took her hand. The left one, the one with the old burn scar she'd carried from Blackwater all those years, faded now to a pale seam, and I held it. And we watched the sun come up. And neither of us said anything, because by then we'd learned that the deepest things pass between people in the spaces where the words aren't. She's gone now. I'll not tell you how or when. It's not yours, and there are doors I still won't open, even here. But I kept my promise. The things are on the shelf. The moccasins and the knife and the twist of hair and the plain gray stone, and beside them Sarah's cup, and I don't know the names of most of them, and it doesn't matter, because I know they were loved, everyone, and this house has room. I light the stove every morning still. I make the smoke. A house with no smoke is only a box that remembers being one, and I'll not let it forget while I'm still here to remember for it. I'm old and I'm alone again, but it's a different alone than the one she found me in. That first alone was a wound. This one's I don't have the word. A fullness, maybe, that just happens to be quiet. The alone of a man who had a whole life pass through his hands and got to feel every day of it and knows exactly what he's missing, which is the only kind of missing worth anything. People ask me still, the few that pass through, why I did it. Why I rode down into a burned town and asked a grieving stranger to come with me. They want the good cowboy story, the clean one. And I don't give it to them because it isn't true, and I'm too old now to keep a false ledger. I tell them the truth. I tell them I did it because I was drowning too, and she was the first hand I'd seen in 3 years, and I reached for it as much to save myself as her. I tell them that the best thing I ever did in my whole long life, I did partly out of my own need, and that this doesn't make it smaller, that maybe the truest kindnesses are the ones where the giving and the getting can't be told apart. 2 drowning people. I just happen to have the horse. And then they ask me, they always ask me, whether I'd do it again, knowing how it ended. Knowing the burying that was always going to come at the end of it, the way the burying comes at the end of everything I've ever loved. I take out the ledger when they ask me that. It's the last one, near full now, soft as a glove. And I show them the page from that first day, the honest, cramped little line I wrote by firelight in a dry wash with a woman I didn't yet know sitting silent across from me. Found one living at Blackwater, coming south with me, does not say her name. And under it, in a hand grown older, added years and years after, when I finally understood what that day had been.